We're going to start with the policy and legislation panel. You can find their full bios by scanning your QR code on your conference program. And so I just want to introduce to you right now Senator Alexander.
Well, thank you so much for being here today and for your participation and for allowing me and these fine folks to participate in this panel. And the panel today is regarding legislative and other policy issues and relating to demand reduction and so forth. Before I start the process here, and I know we're on a kind of a time frame, let me just say how much I appreciate, as I said, what y'all are doing to help stop and fight human trafficking. It's so important. I think I'm going to ask people here, that, we had participation a minute ago. Who all in here? Now, is most people in here from North Carolina? Most people, everybody? Okay. All right. How many of you know who your state representative is? By name? Okay. All right. How about your state senator by the same token? Okay. All right. How many of you have taken the opportunity at any point in time to just mention this topic to them in passing, right? Okay. All right. I think you will find, I believe you will find that if you talk about this topic to them, they will be very open. Most legislators are very approachable and want to hear these kinds of things. And if you approach them in a way that's matter-of-factly and politely and respectfully and, friendly, they'll talk to you. So let them hear about what you have to say, because that's so important. All right, so we're going to introduce the topics and the panelists, and I'm going to allow each one of them to talk about them, to tell about themselves. We're going to start down here with Brandi Lawson, and then we'll go to Bill Woolf, and then Pam Strickland. Well, actually, I had that. Yeah, that's the way we're doing it. So, all right. Okay. I've got my script. And so Brandi, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and a little bit about your interest in demand reduction.
Okay. Hi, my name is Brandi. I am a survivor of labor trafficking with sexual exploitation at an entity that presented itself as a Christian ministry. I hold an associate's degree from Forsyth Tech, and I speak publicly on the overlap of human trafficking within religious organizations. My primary role in advocacy has been religiously oriented and creatively oriented. I teach survivors a concept called poetic aeration with Josie's Guild, a survivor-led publishing company that I co-lead with a fellow survivor. And even though I have this religious and creative approach to trafficking advocacy, I have a strong interest in legislative advocacy so that I can use my experience to create or contribute to the creation of policy that reduces demand and also protects vulnerable populations from falling prey to these exploitative organizations and ways of operating.
All right, very good. And next we'll have Bill Woolf. Bill, tell a little bit about yourself and your interest.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you to the task force for hosting this incredibly important event and this conversation. My name is Bill Woolf. Started my career in law enforcement, and that's where I was first introduced to this issue of human trafficking as a gang detective, which then opened my eyes to the reality of human trafficking that was happening in the Northern Virginia area, which is where I'm from, but then, of course, all across the United States. Worked that for several years, working on federal task forces, investigating human trafficking and prosecuting. Then had an opportunity to go on to the U.S. Department of Justice, served as Director of Human Trafficking Programs, overseeing all the programmatic work that was being done by DOJ, also serving as Acting Director at the Office of Victims of Crime. So for those of you that apply for OVC grants, that was my office overseeing about $6.5 billion worth of federal programming. Was also voluntold to go to the White House and served as senior advisor at the White House and shepherded in the first national action plan to combat human trafficking. But in my role at DOJ, one of the frustrations that I had, both in a programmatic and a policy-focused role, was I knew there were so many incredible organizations and experts that were out there doing the work on the ground. And I know this will shock you, but Washington kind of lives in a bubble. And they're a little disconnected in what's happening in the real world out here. And it was always the same few organizations that DOJ was listening to over and over again. And I got frustrated with that. And so came out and today lead the Woolf Group, which is a government relations and policy firm that works with nonprofits in the anti-trafficking and exploitation space to make sure that your voices are being heard in DC, that policies and new laws that are being enacted are being put forward, and also working at the state level. You all are really lucky in North Carolina to have some fabulous elected officials at the state level, including Senator Alexander, who has been a privilege to work with, just to see his very real passion to bring an end and eradicate human trafficking. So thank you for allowing me to be here today.
All right. Well, thank you. I think you all see that we have three. Excuse me, Pam. Sorry, I was coming down the end down here. Okay.
We might want to
Pam,
switch
go ahead.
seats just so we don't.
So good morning again. I'm Pam Strickland, founder of NC Stop Human Trafficking. And so I've been involved with the anti-human trafficking movement for quite some time now. Actually founded the nonprofit in 2010 and have led mission trips. You know, when I originally learned about human trafficking, like so many other people, I learned about it as something that happens in other places, right? And so it was introduced to me as a foreign topic and had the opportunity to lead several mission trips to the tiny little country of Moldova, which is ground zero for sex trafficking in Eastern Europe because it's such a tiny and poor country. But during the time that I was doing that, I was learning, of course, more and more what's happening here in the U.S. and specifically what's happening here in North Carolina regarding human trafficking, and felt called to bring my efforts a little bit closer to home. Excuse me. And so what that resulted in was eventually starting this nonprofit. One of the main focuses from the very beginning has been training and education, because when I started, it was 2010, you know, we'd had the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that had been passed in 2000, but still nobody knew what human trafficking was. I mean, we're 10 years in and people still don't know what it is. And so from the beginning, that was a big part of our job, is helping people understand what it is and that, yes, it does happen here, not just in these foreign countries. And to this day, that continues to be an important part of our work, although we've sort of changed our focus more towards training professionals who, in the matter, of course, of their job, would come in contact with potential victims of trafficking. So we do a lot of training of law enforcement, social workers, school staff, healthcare providers, mental health care providers, and that continues to be a big part of what we do. We're also very much engaged with coalition building, as evidenced by we helped found the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force. And all during that time, I had a really keen interest in legislation. And, you know, like everyone else, the first law I ever heard about was the TVPA. And so I'm wondering, okay, well, what are we doing here in North Carolina? Well, it turns out it took North Carolina, I think it was 7 years after the TVPA was passed federally, that we even had a human trafficking statute in North Carolina. And when we passed that, it conflicted with some other statutes we had. It made it possible at the federal level, it was clear that you couldn't arrest a minor for prostitution. They were automatically labeled victims. That was not the case because, as I said, we had a conflict in statutes. And so the first time I actually sort of got involved with legislation was around the Safe Harbor Act that got passed here in North Carolina in 2013. And at that time is when we finally have a statute that says, okay, we're not going to arrest children for crimes being committed against them any longer. We are not going to arrest minors for being victims of sex trafficking. And at that time, when I first got interested in legislation, I found to be true exactly what Senator Alexander was telling y'all initially. Your legislators want to hear from you. And that was something I really didn't understand prior to that. You know, I thought, well, they're up in Raleigh, they're up in DC, in their bubble, like you said, and they don't care what people like me think. But I found that is absolutely not the case. That if you walk into the Raleigh office of your representative and they're sitting there shooting the breeze with a buddy, they will kick him out and they will talk to someone from their district. They care what you think. So I just strongly encourage you all to, if any of us say anything that resonates with you, that you think your legislators need to hear, I hope you will contact them and share what your thoughts are to hopefully influence some legislation in North Carolina. Thank you for being here.
Yeah. And as I was about to say, that you have 3 excellently qualified folks to address this panel today. And we are going to be talking about some legislative issues. And one of the purposes for me being here is not so much as to impart information, but I'm here to learn just like y'all, because I want to take the information and the ideas and the recommendations that you have, and we'll take those back as much as we possibly can and work with the legislature. So very much appreciate y'all's willingness to do this today. So we're going to start with some questions, and we give each person about 2 minutes to answer each question, and we'll try not to be too heavy-handed on the time, but we are going to try to whip through several things here. All right, so the first question is regarding an issue that's already been kind of alluded to earlier, and that is education. And can education or educating people reduce demand? And then sort of a follow-up question is, if so, how should that be done? You know, whether it be in schools or public awareness campaigns or something else. And so I'm going to start, I guess, here, and then I'll just go back and forth, I guess. But why don't we start with Bill? And can educating people reduce demand? And if so, how should that be done?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we heard this morning, right? The socialization of men, or at least manhood in our country, certainly leads to the dehumanization of individuals. It leads to the commodification of individuals, which ultimately leads to them being sold, in these cases, for sex or even labor. And so it is something that is critical. I can tell you, in my former role as an investigator, oftentimes interviewing those that were buyers, right? Those that were paying for illicit sexual services. You know, many of them have these misconceptions that I believe are just sort of ingrained because of the society that we live in. You know, they'd say, well, these women or even young men, you know, they enjoy it, they want to do it, it's just a job, they're earning money, right? All these misconceptions that are out there. I've had the honor to work with hundreds of survivors throughout my career, and I can tell you, not one of them has ever said, I enjoyed it, right? But this is sort of the idea that's out there. So we've got to educate, we've got to raise awareness. You know, as Pam was talking earlier, you know, people just don't know that human trafficking is a thing. And if they do, if they've heard of human trafficking, oftentimes our mind goes to either overseas, or we go to what's happening on our borders here in this country, and we're not thinking about the young boys and girls in our own community, our neighbors, our kids' friends, you know, God forbid our own kids, that are being targeted by these exploiters to then be sold for sex, right? We live in a sexualized society. We allow it to continue to be pervasive. We'll hear more about pornography, I know, but how pornography leads to that. We have got to be standing up, both men and women, and talking about the very real realities of human trafficking, and that people are not a commodity.
Okay, thank you very much. Pam?
So certainly educating people can make a huge difference, and the earlier we start, the better. We need to begin, gosh, y'all, in kindergarten and at home before that, you know, as parents, teaching things as simple as the issue of consent, you know, from a very young age, that I don't have to hug anybody I don't want to. That nobody has the right to tickle me if I don't feel like being tickled. I don't have to sit in Uncle Jim's lap if I don't want to. Teach our kids from a very young age that my body is my body, and I get to say who touches it and who doesn't. And, you know, many of you probably grew up like I did, where, you know, give grandma a hug, give Aunt so-and-so a kiss, and if you balked, you were encouraged, right? And it was, you know, obviously our parents didn't know, and it was certainly not intended for anything harmful, but now we do know. We do know that bodily autonomy is something we need to start teaching from a young age. So I would say, you know, starting in kindergarten with those ideas of this is my body and I have a right to say no, and even talking about what healthy friendships look like, you know, that friends don't make friends do things they don't want to do. Friends don't ask friends to do things that make them uncomfortable. And you can teach that in kindergarten. You know, we don't have to wait till they're in high school and start talking about, you know, dating abuse and that kind of thing. We can start talking about that in kindergarten. And if we do, you know, then as they get older and, you know, we can talk about more mature topics. But definitely, yes, we need to start very young talking about this issue in words that our young kids can understand.
Okay. And Brandi.
Okay. So in short, yes, education can absolutely make a difference. And I think one of the things that education can address is why the demand is there in the first place. And that is often this cyclical pattern of exploited individuals becoming the exploiters. And so if we can implement mandated curriculum in schools starting early, we can interrupt that cycle, and we can create opportunities for children to not only recognize, okay, there's something off about my situation, and when they notice that, they can have a safe space to reach out and get some help early on. I personally am aware of an organization called Abolition NC. I have sat in on the curriculum. It is for middle school to high schoolers, and it's a very gentle curriculum that is about anti-human trafficking. They teach on the red flags. They teach the kids their own value. They talk about what vulnerabilities are in a way that is age appropriate. And, you know, if I had taken that course in school with their open-ended opportunity to seek resources, I would have sought out that opportunity and said, hey, you know, I'm not being trafficked right now, but I am experiencing the vulnerabilities that make me subject to later trafficking. Can I get some help and get out of my situation that's occurring at home? So I think it's really important that we, you know, not only mandate curriculum, which I know in North Carolina schools are required to do 2 hours of it, but we need to look at the curriculum we're mandating to ensure that it's contributing to the goal of reducing demand, contributing to the goal of teaching dignity and privacy and respect, and doing it in a really gentle way that's not just throwing sordid, trauma-based stuff at people, and especially children.
All right, very good. So next, we're going to kind of talk about another topic that was mentioned early on, and that is the whole issue of pornography. And as you know, research indicates that the consumption of pornography does increase the demand for the purchase of sex. And so the question is there a way for policy and legislation to impact this, and then how? So why don't I start this time? I'll go down on the end for Brandi if you want to start with this thing.
So for me, I do think we need to criminalize the production and the distribution of porn. I mean, its effects are obviously detrimental to society, and we've got to do something that is a consequence matching the severity of its effect. You know, this idea of digital consumption absolutely normalizes the illicit consumption of sex. And it starts so early. I mean, my own child is 7.5, and we are already starting to have conversations about inappropriate versus appropriate pictures? What is privacy? What is dignity? What is consent? That is an ongoing conversation in our household. But I'm always going to go back to education, because not every household is going to have parents that are really driving home the point of respect and dignity. You're going to have households that have more vulnerable situations, more difficult situations. I didn't have this conversation. I grew up in Section 8 housing. Like, that just was not a conversation. And so if you can mandate education starting in kindergarten about consent, about basic bodily autonomy and dignity and respect of your own body, that's going to translate over time to the children learning that that applies outside of themselves too.
All right. Pam.
I love everything that you just had to say. And something that I think we need to be aware of as parents, and educators in the field, a lot of our education does go towards people who have vulnerabilities, right? And understanding that you have a vulnerability and teaching those people, in our group, we call them, the red flags of people who are unhealthy people and things to be on the lookout for. And there's been a big focus on that. But I think what we're talking about overall here at this conference is, let's not only teach our kids not to be the vulnerable one, but can we teach our kids not to be the predators? Not to be the ones that are taking advantage of the other kids. And so, for instance, when we're talking about healthy relationships, of course, teach them it's okay to say no, but we got to teach the other kids, when a child says no, that means no. If they don't want to be hugged, don't hug them. If they don't want to play with you, find somebody else to play with, so that we are teaching kids from a young age that about other people's dignity, not just our own dignity, right? But going to the issue of the consumption of pornography, one of the frustrations for me personally is when you talk about criminalizing production and distribution, we already have a federal statute that, pornography, pretty much any way you read it, the Obscenity Act, it tells you very clearly that it's illegal. However, the only time it's ever enforced is when it involves minors. And we see that all the time, of course, that it's enforced. Daily there are cases, that come across my email. And of course, our children are vulnerable and we want to protect them. But it's my own opinion that, minors aren't the only ones who need protecting. We know that they are victims of sex trafficking who are in pornographic images, that are not there of their own free will. And we know, pornography is addictive. All the things that John has already said and is going to tell us more about. So when we come down to legislatively, what can we do? Something that our General Assembly did last fall that I was really impressed by is they passed legislation saying that the porn websites have to verify the ages of the people who are consuming porn on their website. As you can imagine, a lot of porn sites got really ticked off about that. And Pornhub, in fact, has now stopped allowing anyone in North Carolina to access their website, which totally breaks my heart, y'all. So that is one thing that's been done. Now, to be fair, I have no idea if there has been any enforcement that's taken place after that, of other websites. And that's something that we need to look at, certainly. But that's one piece of legislation, certainly. And I think in terms of mandating that pornography, the awareness of the harms of pornography be a part of the curriculum that we're talking about would certainly help as well.
And Bill, you've worked in government, obviously, and is there a way that you see for the policy and legislation to impact this, and how?
Yeah, I think I want to start just by highlighting the age verification law that Pam was talking about, and just thank the legislators for taking that on. Folks, I don't know if you realize how much money these industries like Pornhub put into lobbying against bills like this. I mean, we go up, I go up on the Hill, or I go to to the state legislators that we're working with, and I represent nonprofits, right? You all know the budgets of nonprofits, right? So we don't have a lot that we're really working with, up against literally millions and billions of dollars that they are investing to counter this. So it is a big deal, and what will move, if I may be so bold, to move our legislators is your voices on this stuff. So I'd encourage all of you to figure out who your state legislators are in North Carolina and just send them a thank you note today to say thank you for passing that piece of legislation that went into effect January, because it has incredible impact we've seen in protecting our youth. We heard earlier, right, the average age that somebody is first viewing pornography in the United States is 9 to 11 years old. Think about that. As a parent, our children who are developing their brains at that age, being exposed to what's out there, will literally wire their brains differently for the rest of their lives. So we've got to be aware of that. The other thing that I will say is not only do you have the pornography industry, which by the way is highly unregulated, right? And Pam touched on this. A lot of times the individuals that are the actors, if you will, in those videos are actually victims of trafficking. There was a documentary that came out several years ago on Netflix called Hot Girls Wanted. And watching that documentary, I'm saying, yep, I could charge that guy with trafficking, I could charge that one with trafficking, I could charge that one with trafficking, right? The industry itself is rampant with trafficking and obviously exploitation. So we need to be regulating that more, putting more restrictions on how that is allowed to operate and do outreach. But some other legislative issues that we can be addressing are making sure that devices, electronic devices that are internet capable, come with safety features turned on, right? Currently, you have to proactively do that. And a lot of parents, we don't know how to navigate it. I've got 6 kids. I oftentimes go to my teenagers and say, how do I fix this on my phone, right? They know how to use these devices a lot more than we do. And it's difficult to navigate that stuff. There is no reason why the manufacturers should not be selling those devices with the safeties turned on, so that if you want to look at illicit content, you got to go push a button, right? Or you've got to call. The other idea is mandating that the service providers, right? So whether it's like Verizon or Comcast or whoever you all have down here in North Carolina, that you have to actually call and opt in to bypass those filters. Think about that. How many people are going to call and say, yeah, can you please turn the pornography on my line, right? Those types of things that are very simple. You're not taking it away from them, right? You're not charging them anymore. You're just making them take an affirmative action to opt in to accessing that content, right? But for some reason, can't imagine why, the tech industry lobbies against that. The last thing, I'll turn it back over to you, Senator, is we've got to be able to hold the big tech platforms accountable. It's one thing to turn Pornhub off, but you can go on any social media platform. X, you can go, anyone listen to Spotify? There is porn all over Spotify that our young people have access to, right? These platforms need to be held accountable. There's a law at the federal level called the Communications Decency Act that was passed in 2003. There's a section of that law, CDA 230, Section 230, that is a dirty word in my world, because 230 gives tech platforms blanket immunity. They are not responsible for what happens on their platforms. It was originally created with good intent, right? So that if you did something bad on Facebook, Facebook wasn't, and this is before they were the whatever you want to call them now, right? But it was to give them, the ability to operate, right? Free trade. They have taken advantage of that. And if you watch what's happening in DC, many, many hearings have been had on the Senate side talking about holding Meta or X or whatever it's called now and some of the other platforms, right? Accountable for what's happening. And those CEOs, those billionaires, sit behind those tables smirking and saying, you can't make us do any of it, right? millions and millions of dollars up against little old me and our colleagues that are fighting. I know you're going to hear from Michael Shively later. National Center on Sexual Exploitation is doing some incredible work on this, really pushing forward, but it is hard. We've got to have your voices speak into this more.
It's very good, and I'll just speak from personal experience from what Bill's saying. I indeed did introduce a bill last go-round regarding that very thing with the internet, with the phone and, that sort of thing. And Buddy, you should have seen the line of people that started showing up at my office opposed to that. I introduced the bill, it just didn't go anywhere. Now, the issue, the thing becomes, what the purpose of, and the beauty of y'all here, is that when you begin to tie that to something, and this is the something to tie it to, I think you have a much better argument than just like, well, we don't like pornography and we think it's bad. Well, it is. But when you start to make that connection, I think we're going to have a much better opportunity to get some of those kinds of things passed. So I think he's spoke exactly correct. And that was House Bill 8 that passed for the verification, age verification. That was last year, Senator Amy Galey, and it was all as a result of the discussions and so forth that we've had regarding human trafficking that got introduced, and it did pass. So, my hat's off there. Now, here's one sad thing, and then I'll get back to the session. We got an email. Now, first of all, if you ever want to communicate with a legislature, don't send an email to every single legislator and blast whatever it is that you want to tell us. It's just not going to help. Talk individually, work individually, get to know your legislator. Got an email. My 15-year-old boy. And he said something to the effect of, you can pass all the laws that you want, but me and my friends, we like pornography. We want to see it. We're going to find a way around it. We found ways around it. And there's nothing you can do. We like it. And I thought, how sad that this individual who has a heart and a soul, just like we all do, is caught up in that. And, so it's a matter of heart, too. And so we can legislate to a large degree, but it's also a matter of heart, and I pointed that out to me. So anyway, but you're exactly right about they will line up down the hall to fight a bill like that, but the legislators need to hear from folks like yourself. And I think tying it to the human trafficking, making that distinct connection is what's so important. Okay. So now, I did get everybody on that. Okay, despite the fact that buyers are causing immense amount of trauma, we know that in most jurisdictions in North Carolina, buying sex is not considered to be a crime worth charging or investigating. So in y'all's estimation, how can that be changed? And why don't I start this way with Pam?
Well, first of all, it absolutely amazes me that anybody thinks it's okay to buy another person. That just blows my mind, and I know y'all feel the same way who are here. So currently, purchasing sex is a misdemeanor in North Carolina and everywhere else in the country except like 2 states. So I do feel like one way of making folks take it more seriously would be to make it a felony. In the defense of law enforcement, who gets criticized a lot around this issue, the operations to arrest sex buyers, reverse stings, they take an incredible amount of time, an incredible number of people to pull off one of these operations, months of planning, and a huge financial investment. And if they're successful, they end up with a handful of misdemeanors, right? So one can be, can understand why they wouldn't go through all that. And in some cases, if they go through all that, they take it to court, and their DA goes, look, I'm over here dealing with murders and drug cases. why are you bringing me this? And, it just gets dismissed. So I think if we want to have it taken more seriously, that changing it to a felony would help.
Okay. Bill?
Well, I know we have a lot of law enforcement in here, former law enforcement, retired law enforcement. I just want to first say thank you. You put that badge, that uniform on every single day. You walk out of your houses, you kiss your families goodbye, putting your lives on the line to keep our community safe. And so I just really appreciate you and appreciate the sacrifice that you make and that your family makes. I just want to echo what Pam said, and that is, a lot of times we just point to law enforcement and say, well, why aren't they arresting them? Why aren't they doing more, right? That's not always the answer. Their resources are very limited. We're constantly asking our law enforcement officers to do more with less each and every day. And so we do. We have to adjust the laws to make it make sense. So I think increasing buying sex to a felony. I mentioned I'm from Virginia. We had a bill in front of our legislature this year to do it, and it didn't even make it up for discussion in committee, right? We've got to put more pressure and let our legislators know how important this issue is. There's this mindset, right? There's this mindset of, like we talked about, how the buyers just see it as, well, I'm just buying sex and they want to be selling it. There's also this mindset of, well, they're just buying sex. It's not a big deal. They're not hurting anyone, right? But we know based on research that every time they engage in a commercial sex act, it's equivalent to rape. Folks, these are rapists. They're sexually assaulting these women and these men over and over again and paying $50, $100 for it, right? We have got to hold them accountable. We certainly have to educate, like we talked about earlier, but we have to hold them accountable. A misdemeanor, a slap on the wrist, not good enough. The other thing that I'd offer, Senator, is, consider this. Deterrence. I know a lot of people say, I hear this a lot when I talk to, believe it or not, they say, listen, we don't want to increase penalties because it costs the state more to then incarcerate them, right? Folks, it all comes down to the almighty dollar sometimes. So here's what I propose. Make it a felony, not make it a felony, I don't care. Make the penalties, the financial penalties, so high that they can't afford it. $10,000, $20,000 for a conviction. Take that money, put it in a special fund to support survivors of human trafficking in the state of North Carolina. That's what we should be doing.
Very good, very good. Okay, Brandi.
We'll have questions at the end.
Oh, yeah, Brandi.
I love all of that. Thank you. So yes, of course, I believe that we should make sex purchasing a felony. It's incredibly painful for me to see that it's just a misdemeanor, considering, even though my experience is labor trafficking with sexual exploitation, it still caused immense trauma for me. And to understand that somebody in that situation is just going to be charged with a misdemeanor while my life is irreparably damaged is just beyond me. But when we're implementing steeper consequences, I want to make sure that victims are not getting swept up into that as well, because there was a point in my life where, I had run out of resources and was facing homelessness, and the thing that made sense to me, given my history of trauma, was prostitution. It made sense in my brain to sell my body. It made sense for someone to buy my body. Thankfully, that is not the case at that time in my life. That is not what happened. But had I gone down that path, given the laws that we have now, I could have been charged criminally. I could have ended up in jail, and I would have never understood why. There wouldn't have really been an opportunity to learn why. That was wrong. And so I really think that prosecutors, legislators, law enforcement need some trauma-informed training to understand, the motivation towards the action of creating commodities out of human beings. And we should consider how both buyers and victims get to the point where they just believe they're worth a dollar amount and not of basic dignity and respect.
All right, very good. And I hope y'all appreciate the feeling and emotion that comes from Brandi, of course, but all of our our panelists here on this topic, but okay. So, in North Carolina, employers are almost never charged criminally for labor exploitation and trafficking, and so this is a little bit different topic, but how can that be changed? And why don't I start with Bill here?
I think there's two things to consider here, right? When we talk about labor trafficking, it's happening in regular, legitimate businesses. There may be businesses that we visit or frequent or in our own communities. And so we have to be mindful of the economic impact. We also have to be mindful of the resources required. So what we see across the United States at the state level is the state level Department of Labor is severely under-resourced and underfunded to be able to go out and conduct inspections. And so we need to make sure that they're being properly funded. They have the investigators, but they also have the training, right? I go to so many trainings, and we have representatives from law enforcement and social services. Very rarely do we see DOL present, right? So we need to do some outreach, make sure that they're educated, they have the tools and resources that they need. And then we need to clearly define labor trafficking in the statutes. Many states do not. It kind of falls under Fair Labor Standards Act versus having a standalone, clear labor trafficking statute that is enforceable.
All right, and why don't we go with Brandi on this?
Okay. So for this question, I need to say up front that my situation is undergoing an investigation. So my answer to this, as much as I wanted to get into kind of the weeds of my experience, I ultimately cannot do that. But what I can say is that as a survivor of labor trafficking, I understand firsthand just how blurry the lines can be between determining what's forced labor versus regular labor. And those blurry lines often lead to a significant amount of ignorance and thereby inaction. Inaction on the public's part, inaction on Department of Labor, inaction on law enforcement. There's lots of situations where labor trafficking victims are burdened with the responsibility to seek civil restitution. And that's just an impossible thing to ask. And so I think, we do really need to create clear policy that addresses our general understanding of what labor trafficking is and what our professional approach to it is by asking the right questions and creating a clear standard of how we respond to those answers.
All right, and Pam.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to just go ahead and state the elephant in the room, which is when you say the word human trafficking, what comes to your mind? Sex trafficking, right? So the vast majority of people don't even, labor trafficking isn't even on their radar, right? So that's the first problem, is that, when we come to a conference like this one, everybody wants to talk about sex trafficking. A lot of what we're talking about is sex trafficking. We decided as a leadership team, we're going to have a session on labor trafficking because people at this conference probably have never heard a full session on labor trafficking before and just felt that was important. So that's the biggest problem is we're not talking about it. It's not recognized as an issue. And I'm going to call out another elephant and cover your ears, Senator. So North Carolina is an incredibly pro-business, pro-employer state. And even within that, there is no business that gets more love than agriculture, okay? And I'm going to say up front, both of my parents grew up on a farm, okay? So I am not anti-farmer, I'm not anti-agriculture, and plus I like to eat, don't we all, right? So I say that to say this. There is very little will at a state level from either our executive branch or our legislative branch to hold employers accountable. There's just not. And I'll share with y'all, I told you earlier I was involved with the Safe Harbor Act when it was getting introduced and debated and all that here in North Carolina. And at the time that was introduced, it was also proposed that along with all the ensuring that our minors not be arrested for being victims, we also wanted to go ahead and put some things in there about labor trafficking. And that was nixed right off the bat. That never even got introduced. The people who were trying to introduce it were told, look, if you want this other stuff to go through, you need to forget this stuff about labor. So again, you know, and we keep beating this horse, if you all tell your legislators that this is something important to you, then maybe we can start to get some traction on this. But until we have a major change in attitude, that's where we are with labor trafficking here in North Carolina.
Okay, all right. So next, what we're going to talk about now is legislation. What legislation or policy, all right, this is a big question, would make the biggest difference in reducing demand for the purchase of sex? And Brandi, go ahead. Why don't you go there first?
So, you know, my ending up in my situation of being trafficked was not just a happenstance thing. I lived a lifetime of degradation of my humanity, of violations, childhood abuse, neglect. And so ending up in that situation was a culmination of vulnerabilities. So for me as a survivor, I'm always going to go back to early intervention. I'm always going to go back to early education. And that is going to take time. It's going to take generations of time to make those massive changes in a society that is sex-driven, that is money-driven. You know, those two things, those drives automatically reduce humanity. And now we're trying to shift gears and teach people that humanity matters. You know, so again, I'm always going to advocate for education, but in the short, I think it's really, really important that we come up with rehabilitative training. So anyone, regardless if they're charged with misdemeanor sex buying, maybe one day felonious sex buying, they are required to participate in some sort of rehabilitation and education. We could implement that tomorrow, I mean, in theory. And that would contribute to reducing the demand, because maybe some of these people don't understand that what they're doing is wrong, just as much as I didn't understand that selling my body was going to be wrong.
Okay, all right. Pam?
So we've already talked repeatedly about making the purchase of sex a felony. So I think that would make a huge difference. But I think something that we've talked about several times up here too is education, and what you were just now talking about, just a change in perspective at the societal level, which, you know, wow, you can't mandate that, right? We can't legislate that, really. But what we can mandate or legislate is training. It's required training of law enforcement, our district attorneys, our judges, because this is true when I talk to the general public, but this is also true when I talk to these professionals who are in positions of real power. They don't understand what sex trafficking is. They just don't. I mean, even people who have been through trainings, they still want to differentiate people who choose to be prostitutes and people who are victims. And because part of that is we all have this perfect victim, right? And the perfect victim is a child who, you know, has been abused, and because they're a child, they pull at our heartstrings, right? And when you see a 25-year-old woman who's addicted to drugs and she's belligerent and not a pleasant person to be around because of all the trauma and everything you talked about in her childhood, She doesn't like law enforcement. She doesn't trust them. She doesn't like the DA. She doesn't like, has no reason in her background to trust law enforcement DAs or judges, right? And so we look at that person and she's not the right kind of victim, right? She's not a sympathetic person that we want to help. And so what I'm suggesting is if we could expose more of our law enforcement, our DAs, and our judges to survivors, and let them talk about what their childhood was like, and let them talk about how they ended up in a situation where they were being prostituted. That I think that would just help their perspective a lot. So I think it just comes down to understanding it, and to understanding, no, they didn't choose to be there, because who chooses that? I mean, did any of y'all present that as a possible career choice for any of your children? You could be a nurse, you could be a doctor, you could be a teacher, or you could be a prostitute. So this mindset that they made a choice and so let them deal with it is very prevalent in the general public as well as in these positions of power. And I think it's simply because they have never met a survivor and heard how they actually got there.
All right, Bill.
Ditto. So I echo my two colleagues up here. I just think it's spot on. It's a combination of education, training, resources. I'll just kind of put my emphasis on the deterrence factor. We have billboards across the state. We have signs in restrooms that say, are you a victim of human trafficking? Get help. Or to the general public, do you see human trafficking? Well, if you put a big billboard up that says, if you buy sex in the state of North Carolina, you got to pay a $25,000 fine, right? These are the types of things that I think are deterrents. Right into the law that if you're caught buying sex in the state of North Carolina, somebody's going to show up and tell your wife about it. Listen, I'm more scared of that than I would be of going to jail, right? I'd be like, no, just take me to jail. We've got to work more on the deterrence factor, and I think education is a big part of deterrence.
All right, we've got one last question to the panel, and then we're going to have some time for questions from y'all. And I may say a few words if we have some time at the very end. But let's go on next, because we did talk about the sex trafficking. And as Pam mentioned, the other aspect of human trafficking is the labor traffic. So basically, this is sort of the same question regarding exploitation for labor. So, all right, y'all are trying to sell the legislature and lawmakers on what policy would make the biggest difference in reducing demand for the exploitation of labor? What legislation or policy would make the biggest difference in reducing demand for the exploitation of labor? Bill, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. Yeah, I think Brandi talked about it a little bit earlier, right? And that is clearly defining what it is, right? So I would challenge the legislature to adopt a statute that clearly defines labor trafficking in North Carolina and then breaks it down between what is a civil violation versus a criminal violation. We've got to be able to hold employers criminally accountable if they are negligent in perpetrating or facilitating labor trafficking. We cannot tiptoe around it. I agree with what Pam said. It's important to be able to support business. It supports the economy. It supports the state as a whole. But at the same point, when they cross that line, and they did it intentionally, they've crossed the line, and they should not be given any leeway from there.
Okay, Pam?
Well, I just want y'all to know Bill stole mine.
I was reading over your shoulder.
He read my notes. Charge employers criminally. Brandi even said that that labor trafficking victims are expected to bring civil suits. Well, think about the situations that got someone to be in a labor trafficking situation and then the trauma they've been through in that situation. they probably don't have either the emotional or the financial, I'm guessing, means to bring suits. And the only ones that I personally am aware of here in North Carolina have been brought by legal aid or similar organizations who would assist victims in bringing civil suits. And y'all, even when they do that, the fines are embarrassing. I mean, they don't hurt these multi-million-dollar businesses. And I mean, to the point where basically it's a cost of doing business, right? You know, I can have this extremely cheap labor, and if I should happen to get called on it, then I pay a $20,000 fine. Whoop-de-doo, you know, on to the next thing. So I think, I love what Bill said about creating a really clear statute, which we don't have, and to make it a criminal charge. People would take it more seriously.
Brandi.
So, you know, as a survivor of labor trafficking, you know, I witnessed the tremendous amount of greed that affected my life and my personhood. And so when you talk about culture having a very driven focus on sex and money, I think it's fair, regardless of what you believe about economics, to acknowledge that unfettered capitalism contributes to this culture of people becoming products and buyers purchasing that product. Even in the workforce, you're always worth how much can you bring to my company, not what are your strengths, what are your values. I mean, that's not every company is like that. It's the ones I've worked for, very exploitative. And so this profit-driven buyer product situation is a perfect breeding ground for exploitative practices and really dehumanizing people. You know, in my experience, one of the primary points of financial gain for my traffickers was the vulnerabilities I have. It was, what can we pull out of your past to twist around to control you and make money off of it? And so if we're going to implement policy, one, we need better red tape involved with employers, especially in the agriculture industry. We need greater accountability. And because my situation involved a religious element, you know, I advocate very strongly for clergy abuse laws to be present in North Carolina, and they are not right now. There are only 14 states with clergy abuse laws, and I think that is a terribly sad statistic. We can do better. And you can also, again, you're going to protect vulnerable populations through education, intervention programs, and even taking that a step further and revitalizing social services, revitalizing those safety nets. You know, there are many situations with survivors where social services is involved in their situation, and they don't do anything. They don't have the time, they don't have the resources, they don't have the money, and we have to embolden those safety nets. Otherwise, we're just going to keep perpetuating vulnerable populations falling prey to exploitative work situations and subsequent trafficking. And so, as we're creating policy, I know that lobbyists are involved in all of this, and my greatest hope is that legislators start to prioritize people over the profits that these lobbyists bring.
All right, well, that's all of the formal questions that we have, but I think you get from a feel, from this, a sense from these speakers, the depth and breadth, the knowledge that they bring to this whole topic. And as a legislator, I am, of course, very appreciative of hearing these kind of comments, and I hope we've captured all of them somewhere, because I should have been taking notes, but I can't chew gum and take notes at the same time. But now is an opportunity for you that something may have been said, something may have been, that has triggered something that you want to ask about. So we're going to try to do that. Do try to make your questions sort of brief and to the point, and I'll try to take you as I see you, and we'll start over here.
And if you'll wait to ask the question
until
Ethan gets to you.
We have the marvels of modern technology. Allow you to
This young lady over
service.
here.
Thank you very much. With how ingrained pornography is in our culture, is there any use, in your opinion, in educating, like, I don't know if there is such thing that exists as like good porn versus bad porn with regards to like leading or involving exploitation, and just seeing similar, like an analogy with regards to like abstinence-only education versus educating young people on safe sex practices. Is there any like curriculum like that exists, or is there any use for that type of curriculum? Because I wouldn't have any idea how to like educate a young person on how to do that safely, knowing that they're likely going to do it, especially our young men.
So I'll jump in first, and I think you're going to hear from Michael Shively later, and he's much more of an expert than I am in this space. One of the things that I have learned is part of the problem with pornography is that when somebody views pornography, obviously it elicits a sexual arousal, right? But it is a different chemical that is released than during a normal, like, intimate, in-person encounter, right? And so the problem is that it starts to rewire the brain in a way that becomes a slippery slope, right? And so it's almost like an addiction to a drug. You know, you can do a drug one time, right, and it fills certain receptors in the brain, right? But then you want more, and you want more, and you want more. And so that becomes part of the issue. And the reason that, my understanding is, the reason that it escalates so quickly is because now you're trying to get that same high, you're trying to get that same pleasure that you are experiencing when you're watching pornography, and it's impossible to get it because it is a different chemical, right? So I would caution against kind of going down that, and it's not even, I'm not even stepping into this from the moral, component, that the argument that might be around it, but more so in the fact that there is a very physiological response that can't necessarily be controlled by just regulating the type of pornography that you're watching.
Okay, I saw somebody here, well, then we'll hear, and then this gentleman here. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ruth Crescenzo. I just retired from the National Guard, in the military as a Special Victims Counsel. In the military, we have attorneys who represent victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, and then we're expanding to sexual harassment. So the question is for Bill and Brandi, what, if any, role do you see for victims, survivors, having an individual legal advocate for their interests?
Can you rephrase that question? I'm sorry, I didn't
Okay,
quite
here we go.
comprehend.
We're going to talk real. If you had an attorney as a victim,
Yep.
would that have been useful for you? Would that be useful at the interview process, at the prosecutorial process, during the processes? Would I guess that for you, would that be helpful? And then from you, Bill, what do you think about that that concept that the military's doing? Thank you.
So for me, yes, absolutely. It's helpful to have legal counsel present, when you're recounting your experience. I did not have that. I kind of wished I did, but I have that now moving forward in our investigative process. I think what's most challenging when it comes to being a victim and needing advocacy is finding an advocate that's also going to bear the brunt of the emotional side of going to court. I have sought resource after resource after resource, and again and again and again, I'm told we only do court appointments. We only do court visits. We only do investigative visits. We do not have the resources to support your emotional state when you are enduring court. And so I think we really need to either come... Yes. Like, we need someone who can burden how difficult it is to go over your experience multiple times, and even be in the same room as the individual who trafficked you. Like, that, you gotta need more than just the logistical, you've gotta have the emotional too.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Yeah, I mean, I think the role of advocates is incredibly understated in this space, right? And so I'll just say, it's a little bit of me whining, but, from my investigative days as a detective, I had to play that role, right? And that was hard because, I'm always trying to put the survivor first and understanding those emotional needs and trying to make sure that they're connected to appropriate services while also meeting the demands of the prosecutor as we're prepping for trial and doing all these other things. And then trying to explain that process to a survivor at the same time, right? Not feeling like, and so, we always used to say, and you go into that, you say, well, you don't need an attorney because, it's really the state versus the defendant, or, in this case, the military against the defendant. And so the prosecutor is like your attorney. Well, no, the prosecutor has different priorities, right? And so I think it's incredibly important to really make the survivor feel supported and have somebody that's fighting for them, that understands the process in the system, that understands both sort of what the emotional and service-based needs are, but also understands the criminal justice process or the judicial process. And then other laws. So I'd love to have a side conversation. We're working on UCMJ consent, age of consent issues right now, so we'd love to get your opinion on that too.
All right, I saw a gentleman back here with the red shirt. And then after that, I see a lady here with the pink. Is that?
This question is specifically for Brandi. And Brandi, first, I'm a firm believer that voices like yours are the most powerful in this fight. Thank you for having the courage to be sitting in front of this room today, sincerely from the bottom of my heart, and I'm sure I echo other people in the room. So I know what my opinion is on this, but I'd like to hear your perspective. You can't open any news entity today without seeing where a teacher has an OnlyFans page or an attorney has an OnlyFans page, and they get discovered and they talk about all the money they're making on OnlyFans. What are your views regarding the way that OnlyFans encourages the use of a woman's body in a sexually explicit way to produce revenue? Can it be positive? Can it be positive or negative? Is it always negative? What is your perspective on that?
I think it's always going to be negative. I mean, I understand that people are going to supposedly choose to do that, but if you dig underneath that choice making, you're going to have very malicious intention or very wounded intention. And regardless of either way you look at those intentions, you're still sending a message, especially if you're a teacher, especially if you're an authority figure doing this. You are sending the message to the people that you influence that this is what you should be doing with your body. And that, that gets emboldened by porn and other things. So I think it's really, really sad and unfortunate, and it absolutely has a negative impact. Does that answer the question?
Your opinion echoes mine.
Okay.
Okay, we have the lady over here.
So I'm a clinician, and all of the victims that I deal with, they don't prosecute because they don't want to go to court because they don't want to see their trafficker. So that makes it really hard to prosecute or to keep the trafficker liable if the victim does not want to go through the court process, and that's 90% of the victims that I see. So what do we do about that?
Just wait. I'll say one thing, then I'll allow y'all. We did pass last time. It's probably not solid for everything, but we did pass it. We created the statutory right for human trafficking victims to seek permanent lifetime no contact orders against the trafficker. I don't know if it specifically addresses that, but it is on the right track. But go ahead.
I would like to answer as a victim who, is currently in this investigative process. When I brought my complaint forward, my very thorough complaint, I was told right out of the gate I was not enough. We needed more victims. We needed more and more and more, and along the way it was still, we need more. And that was incredibly excruciating. That was very defeating, because I over here was the first one to come forward with these very bold claims of like, this is what's happening here, and this is who is doing it. And to do that, knowing all these other victims behind me, that are too scared to come forward because they're going to be told the same thing, or they're going to run out their statutes, or they're scared to face this individual in court. And so, yeah, I wished there was a way to make it easier on the victim. It feels like the burden of proof lies with me, and my body is that proof, and it's painful to be told it's not enough when I'm like, look at my medical records, look at my psych records, it's there. I don't know why I need to be the burden of proof for you. We have to change that because it's too much to ask.
Hi, thank you for having us as well. But before I became assistant district attorney, I was actually an immigration attorney for a few years who actually dealt with labor trafficking victims and sex trafficking victims. The one thing that kind of like frustrated me the most is that I can't tell you how many hours I spent just trying to get them resources, and how many victims couldn't leave labor trafficking situations because they couldn't afford to like feed their families or anything like that, and how many for the sex trafficking victims I dealt with as well, I spent hours on the human trafficking hotline not being answered. And then I finally got in touch with the 821, which I'll say is an amazing nonprofit here. And they were the only ones who actually give the resources to help these clients. But like, what can we do to get them this? And what can we do to get them the money or anything support, psychologically or financial?
Really good question. Anybody want to tackle that?
So I have a solution that might make me very unpopular depending on who is in this room. So I may need an escort out. However, there is a big discussion right now at the national level about an approach that's being called funding follows the survivor. And the idea behind this is that instead of large grants going to nonprofits where we're not sure if they're actually serving survivors, we're not sure how they're allocating funds, that essentially it would create a general fund. So in this case, like North Carolina would create a general fund that is being funded by the buyers that are now being charged $20,000 fines. That money, once there's an intake, right? So you identify that survivor, there's a central coordinating entity, right? You've got the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission that could serve as such here in North Carolina. They would do an intake, determine, yes, this is a qualifying survivor, and then funding would follow them to that placement facility, right? So there's not a question of where's the money coming from, who has open beds. We already know, and it's already taken care of, and that eliminates additional stresses on that survivor. It also eliminates delays in getting them care because there is a streamlined system set up. But it does require some legislative change at the state level.
If I could add to that, the fines that you proposed funding this were for sex buyers. So we'd have to be careful in identifying the pot of money that it would be available to any victim, not just sex trafficking victims. Because what we know across the state is we have a number of nonprofits that are serving victims of human trafficking, and they're all serving victims of sex trafficking. And some of them, don't misunderstand me, if there's something they can do to help a labor trafficking victim, they will, but that's not their setup. That's not what their experience is. That's not what their expertise is. And a lot of times in the labor trafficking cases, you could be talking about 10 or 20 people, and finding housing and resources for that kind, it just puts us in a whole other ball game, is my point. And I think that's another one of the reasons that we are not addressing labor trafficking is so overwhelming. I mean, because we think to ourselves, okay, I go to this farm, I find these 20 migrants who are being terribly mistreated, what am I going to do with them? I don't have housing for 20 people. So that's another one of the problems.
Okay, I saw a gentleman in the back, and then I saw a hand here and there, and it's probably going to take us to the end. We've got about 10 minutes. Okay.
I was just going to affirm Bill's point about the money following the survivor, because The other issue is that it's so hard to start up safe houses and provide beds and things like that. You know, you have to be already providing services in order to get grants. So if you could start up, say we're here, and then you're already in the queue for receiving, you know, survivors to provide services, and that money is flowing without having to worry about, you know, or putting a huge premium on building a bank, you know, to support them. So I think that's a great idea. Thank you.
I guess more of a comment. Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, thank you. Okay. I got a lady over here and then a lady over here.
So I have to speak as the wife of a correctional facility officer in saying that the state of North Carolina right now is generally strained when it comes to time for government employees to train, let alone funding to be able to go do that. So that's a huge issue that we're facing in the state right now. So my first question would be, technically, do you guys have plans as an agency or a group or an organization to address the capacity, because our folks are very stretched thin, to address that? And then secondly, as a volunteer who works with families in what we call legal human trafficking, AKA foster care, what are you guys addressing as far as the pipeline from foster care to trafficking? And are you working with anybody who's willing to do that? Because I'm willing to work with you guys on that. So those are my two questions.
I just want to say thank you for pointing out the foster care system and that you're willing to work on that.
I think it's pretty widely known that the foster care system is has a lot of issues. We know that traffickers will specifically go after children who are in care, knowing how vulnerable they are. And we know that a lot of those kids run away from foster care to a trafficker. I'll say, when I first became interested in this topic and became aware of all the issues with foster care, and my immediate thought went to, well, we need to have higher standards for the people who are allowed to be foster families, right? That seemed obvious to me, because if you go, folks, I mean, the criteria is scary. But then what I became aware of is, even with this incredibly low bar that we have, we don't have nearly enough foster families. So I wish I had an answer to that. You know, as a person of faith myself, seems to me something that our faith community should really be looking at, is encouraging our people of faith to step up and acknowledge that there are kids that need that kind of help. But I wish I had an answer to your question. We're aware that it's a problem. We know, as you already said, DSS is incredibly short-staffed, as is the criminal justice system. I don't see an easy answer.
Well, and you asked kind of a legislative kind of governmental question. I'll try to answer that. About training, I'm not really aware of that topic, so that's good for me to hear, because that's why and I'd love to talk more. I will say that some of the things we've been looking at is trying to find ways of building in training to things that are already existing. Our state highway patrol, and I saw a highway patrolman here earlier, does an outstanding job of training their folks in the whole issue of, I guess, interdiction and so forth, human trafficking. Does a great job. One of the things that we as a legislature said, you know, we need to start at our own backyard. So we approached our General Assembly police. We have a police force for the General Assembly. We said to our chief, would you allow our folks to be trained? So immediately, yes. And I think y'all are doing that. You're going to start working them in as you can for the training there. So I think there's probably ways of doing that. I'd love to talk more about that. It's not a topic that I was even aware of. So thank you for bringing that up. We have another lady over here. Is there anybody has a burning question after that? There is a burning question.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to to the panelists. I am Sata Sedi from Family Service of People. I represent the immigrant and refugee population, and I work as a victim advocate, a human trafficking outreach specialist. So one of the things I observe working directly with clients is that some of them always go back to the situation, right? And then one of the things I also look at is that our immigrant population, most of the time, all the clients I serve, they are from the immigrants and refugee population. So what are you doing? What are those things you have in place to be able to prevent them to come out to actually admit that this is what I'm going through? Because sometimes they do not. They do not admit the fact that this is what I'm going through. It's difficult for them to agree. So what are those things in place as service provider that we can gather for survivors to really come out so that they can seek help? And one of the things with labor trafficking too, I was part of it. It was a family member of mine, right? I was undocumented for some time, and I was working. Imagine, I was cleaning up. I was cleaning 7 school buildings, and he would pay me $700 per month. Imagine how many people are out there going through the same situation, and they are afraid to come out, as she said. They cannot come out because they have to survive. So what are those things that we can put together to have these survivors coming out to help them to get the services that they need?
I can just comment briefly on that. I agree 100%. I think one of the things that's lacking in aftercare services is economic empowerment, right? So a lot of times we focus on residential care, which is important, access to mental health and physical health, but what we're putting people into programs that are 6 to 12 months long, and then at the end of those programs, we're like, thanks, have a great life, right? We're just kind of sending them off. And so they don't, a lot of times my experience is those that are in those types of programs, it creates a lot of anxiety and stress having to think about, well, what's next, right? Because they don't know that there's a plan to support them as far as reintegration back into society. So I think that we need to put a little more focus on transitional housing. We need to put some more focus on workforce development. There's a really great program, a model that was created by an organization called Survivor Ventures, if you're familiar. Basically, the program is they intake that survivor when they're ready, and they will provide housing, an apartment. They train them, get them connected to employment. And so for the first quarter, so it's a year-long program, for the first quarter of their training, Survivor Ventures covers 100% of their salary. So it lowers the risk to the employer to bring them on board, right, as well as their funding. Second quarter, it's 75%, 50%, 25%. So it's kind of this weaning where you transition the cost to the employer. So it engages employers in having trauma-informed workplaces, which is incredibly important for survivors of trafficking, while it also gives them opportunities to transition while receiving wraparound supportive services throughout that process. We need more programs like that.
I just want to say, I think it's also important to note the language that we use around it, especially when you're talking about relapse and return. You know, I was told that my returning to my trafficking situation was indefensible, which is excruciating. It's excruciating to, one, have a difficult time articulating even why I returned, and two, to be told, well, we can't defend you. Like, you as the victim should have known better, even though I wasn't taught what was better or how to do better. And so, you know, that's kind of an expectation I feel like the general population has on you. You should have just known better. And so we really have to, again, we've got to go back to education. If we can educate people with trauma-informed training to understand this concept of return, we can start to develop programs like Bill was talking about.
Very good. One burning question in the back.
Hi, my question is, I would just like to know your guys' opinions on how you think trauma and poverty affects sex trafficking, because personally, we're from a street outreach team that works with homeless youth and young adults, and we all have a lot of experience combined, and we've only seen kids who are in trafficking, it's primarily girls and women as well, who are living below the poverty line and have extreme levels of trauma, and a lot of the sex trafficking happens when they're turning to have their basic needs met. And that is a really big issue that we've seen, and we work in a housing program and there isn't enough resources. So, you know, to hear someone say that a teacher with an OnlyFans account has malicious under intent, but yet we live in a country where there's a huge wage gap between men and women. She's college educated and she's still not making enough to make ends meet. What can we do about that besides saying that she has malicious intent when what else are you doing if you're that person? Well, every girl I've met has come from a place of extreme poverty where she didn't have any resources and fell into it to get her needs met. So I feel like I haven't heard poverty touched on as much as I think it is affecting this as a larger issue.
Did y'all hear?
Yeah. I would say that at our nonprofit, we are always saying the best way to prevent human trafficking is a living wage and affordable housing. and those, you know, those two things aren't in our list of human trafficking prevention strategies. But I mean, you're completely right. I mean, the people who become vulnerable are simply trying to get their needs met. And I'm just going to say it, the minimum wage here in North Carolina is $7.25. It's not a living wage. It's not anywhere close to a living wage. And in my own city, Greenville, I mean, there are people who are working full-time jobs that can't afford to get an apartment in Greenville because of the escalating housing cost. So I completely agree with you. Now, what we do to convince government and business to increase wages to a living wage and to make housing affordable, whew, I don't know how we do that. Bill, how do we do that?
I think we can figure that one out, Willie. But I think you're spot on, right? So I mean, trafficking, and Brandi mentioned this earlier, right? Trafficking is all about a vulnerability, right? Whether it's an employer that's targeting a particular vulnerability or a sex trafficker, and certainly persons experiencing homelessness and in poverty are very much, that is a vulnerability that can be taken advantage of, right? And so we've got to, I think it's part of a much larger conversation, but starting to really dig in on what are those root causes, what are those societal issues that are precursors to vulnerabilities, and starting to address those at the community level. I do want to say, and again, I know this is not a faith-based conference, but just sort of echoing what Pam said, you know, as a person of faith, I do believe the churches need to step more into this space. They have been avoiding it, and they could be so much more impactful in addressing a lot of these issues, including vulnerabilities.
Okay, so these have been excellent questions, an excellent panel, and it's almost time for lunch, and I'm debating as to whether or not I should say anything or not. You know, I'm a politician, so, you know. So I will say couple things if I can. I won't stay long. I did hear something about the aspect of a change of perspective can't be legislated, and I think that's true. But I do think that changing the perspective of the legislator is what causes legislation. So you have the opportunity to talk to your legislator, to talk to your state senator, your state house member, and others, and tell them about this issue that is so important to you. They deal with 5,000 different other issues. This is important to you, and if you convey that, it will be important to them. It won't be the most important thing. Now just keep that in mind. It just may not be. It's just the way it is. But it may be important enough for them to take an active role, to vote for a particular bill, to help shepherd something on a little more further. You just take it a little piece at a time. And, you know, like so many other things with legislation, if we could all wave our magic wand today and create the perfect bill, the perfect perfect program, we would do it. But like so many other things, it's just like, you know, just small incremental steps, and we'll start working toward it. We have as a legislature, and some of y'all may be aware of this, I'm going to give you a real brief rundown of what we did last year, and then I'm going to mention a couple things that we plan to do this year. Okay, so in the past, what we did is we did fund a permanent position and appropriated $1 million for the biennium for the creation of a competitive grant program through the Human Trafficking Commission. It's not perfect, but it is there, and it's new, and it had not been done before. We appropriated $10 million to the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency for 3 areas: homeless veterans, abuse and domestic abuse victims, and human trafficking. The North Carolina Housing Finance Agency really wants to do this well. They really want, they don't have experience in human trafficking. They really want and desire to hear from y'all as to how to design that housing program. And some good ideas were mentioned here, and somebody else mentioned something a minute ago. So keep that in mind. But you're going to have to act fast because they're trying to get this in the pipeline quickly. We provided monies for the Council of Youth and Women in Youth Involvement. We gave more money for them for awareness. You know how important building awareness is. And then we also provided $1 million recurring in the first year, and then $1.5 million the second year for more organizations that provide services of victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. And that relates directly many times to what you're doing here. All right, this legislative year, probably this week sometime, we're going to kind of roll out some of the issues that we've been looking at. And we'll probably be, the staff will probably be running them by our Human Trafficking Commission. I think they're going to contact Pam here and others, and we're going to have to, we need feedback pretty quickly. Now, we don't want people come down, raining down on our heads. We just need to know what, if there's something that needs to change or tweak, it's okay. Because we don't know the answers to all this. But here's the kinds of things right now that we're talking about. We may not get them all this go around. One is updating the applicable affirmative defenses for victims. This would be possibly for the crimes of shoplifting, drug possession, and identity theft, financial fraud, and theft of motor vehicle. Those are things that oftentimes people caught up in human trafficking are charged with. And so we're trying to look at seeing what we can do about, helping those areas. Changing the wording of statutory language to remove child prostitution, and that's something we've heard loud and clear from the folks in what y'all do. Revising victim confidentiality, it's important. Updating the non-child custody forms to ensure that sexual predators are identified to judicial officials. And then require the recording for child welfare interviews so that there's no question about what that child, if it's a victim of child trafficking or whatever, there's no question about what they said. It's not just up to the interpreter of somebody to tell somebody what they said. Also the creation, we hope, of a statewide human trafficking specialized prosecutor. We don't have anybody like that right now. And then also continue to work with some of the expunction laws, which was sort of alluded to earlier. When people get caught up in this and they do things and they were under duress, okay, we can look at that and see if we can get those expunged. So there will be some of these and some of the other things that we hope fairly soon to come out with, primarily because we have heard from folks like y'all. And that's what we want to continue to do. It's going to be a slow process. We can't solve everything today. And we won't always solve everything exactly the way that you or I would want to see them solved, but we were working with them. And I think you're going to find that this legislature is very amenable to doing a large number of the kinds of things because our survival as a society depends on it. I want to thank the speakers. If you would give them...